one place for like 3 minutes is an eternity. Yeah. Yeah.
I know, that's why I didn't know where you were going to sit, so then I was like, well, you're here now, so it's not like, where am I going to sit? I did. I let you have your choice.
Well, Daisha puts on either side, so this is the seat on the far end for me.
And the awkward.
Just remember, I've got a shoulder issue over here, so if I put my arm on it's going to be the same.
Just don't rub her shoulder. We're good. Okay? You rub this one right here.
I see where we're going. So we're going to do this.
We're just keeping it weird and awkward down here. It's the fun side here.
Some of us might call it normal.
I feel like the back row's already getting dirty with it.
But I've already started before.
Everyone can hear us. Room for Jesus.
Okay, I don't have my good one, but I have my nail kit. There's one in there. It was a Christmas present last year.
There's like some weapons in there.
There are. Did not get out of there. Noted. Noted. Will they even let you on an airplane with clippers?
Yes.
They, okay.
They won't let you in the Capitol, though.
Oh, I've taken a knife from me before.
All righty, we're going to get started. We're in week 5, middle of unit 2. We're talking about the history of music from a sacred perspective tonight. Now, what I mean by that is a perspective of what the world calls sacred. Okay. Last week we looked at music from a scriptural point of view. This we're going to broaden out quite a bit, and we're going to look at what essentially what the world, the Christian world, says about music tonight. Couple of notes. When I say the word Christian tonight, it's not like last week. Last week was scripture. This week, we're talking about the worldly definition of Christian. That is all denominations included, divisions, etc. And then another thing that I need to be clear about is when I'm referring specifically to instruments, I am only referring to instruments in worship, okay? Not like instruments in general, okay? So that was one question that had come up over the week is, the topic of the class is musical instruments in New Testament worship is really that's what we're focused on, not instruments outside of that, okay? We'll address some of that later on, but that's the topic here. And then the last thing that I need to go over is we are going to be talking about a lot of different denominations. And this, you have to understand, and I think we understand this like just colloquially, that this is a generalization, right? Even if we were to talk about the churches of Christ in Oklahoma City, we're going to have differences of opinion from one congregation to another, right? And so if we were to put a single bullet to the churches of Christ that is all-encompassing, we're going to be wrong. We're also going to be right, okay? So when we're talking about all of these denominations, understand that this is a majority, okay? Not necessarily the way that they do it. And so I'm sure for every one of these on here, you can find groups that are more liberal, more conservative. This is about where we're going to be kind of in the middle. For each one of the slides, the template here is we're going to have a denomination, and we're going to look at when were they founded, who is the founding member. What years did they live? And why would that be important to know? Well, that's coming later, right? So we have a person, we have a birthday, or we're going to go birth year and death year. Why do we care about that? Or why should we care about that tonight?
How something changes after the passing of the founder?
Yes. And who is the founder? Christ, right? So that's going to be important to note when we're looking at these. When did this denomination start? When was the New Testament written? And how much time elapsed between the two? And why did they start? This is not a denominational study tonight. We're not talking about what caused the founding of that denomination and whatnot, but that's the thing that's interesting to point out is the years. We are going to go chronologically. We are going to have a direct quote, a primary source quote from that founder that was their opinion on music in worship. And then we're going to see what they felt about instruments in music in worship. You can probably guess what they thought, given the topic of the class. And then we're going to see when instruments were introduced into that denomination, and also why. What was the common justification in their day for introducing instruments at that time? Okay. We're not going to discuss the justifications tonight. That's next week. Okay. Tonight, I want you to see from a very broad perspective how consistent this is. We're going to just get right started into it. Last week, we talked about Scripture by authority, by the language of the Greek, by the application of obedience. Instruments in New Testament worship have no place. Okay. Starting way back in 153 AD with the early church, what would become the Eastern Orthodox Church. There's some quotes up here that I'm not going to read to you. You're welcome to read them. But these, Clement of Alexandria, Eusebius, and John Chrysostom, are very, very well cited. These are common. The thing to note, though, is the very bottom one. The Eastern Orthodox Church today still does not accept instruments in worship. Okay, and they quote all the way back to Clement of Alexandria, 153, 153 to 217, somewhere around in there.
Do you have any idea what Clement means by being no longer?
Yeah, he's referring to Jewish history. The psaltery, the trumpet, the timbrel, and flute, instruments of the temple. It's a good question. Yeah, that was in commentary of Jewish practice versus New Testament practice, essentially. Roman Catholics. I put Pope Gregory the First up here. He was the one who introduced Gregorian chant because it was strictly vocal. This is an early strong evidence that this was the Gregorian chant was progressive in his day. Okay, and it was still vocal. Like there are no instruments here, right? And so I wanted to establish that before then, this was the this was the rock music of the day. Yeah.
Could you give us a quick demonstration?
I could not.
What is the Gregorian chant?
Okay. Actually, thank you, Kyle. If I had thought about it for just a half a second, I could have pointed out a song that we have in our songbook here that is a Gregorian chant. We're not going to see it in our modern day notation, but there is a song, and I wish I could remember the number at the moment. I can picture it in my head. You'll just kind of thumb through probably the next time Tim is speaking, I guess. But anyway, there is a song that has like a whole note and then a whole bunch of words written under it, right? I know, right? Right? And then there's another whole note. And then a whole bunch of words written under it. Well, how are you going to say a lot of words with one whole note, right? And it's because that you stood on that same pitch and you spoke the rhythm of the chant. Okay. Now, when we say chant, we're talking about something that we're speaking in rhythm and rhyme, think about like an athletic event, right? That's not necessarily what the Gregorian chant was. It was a call and response, mostly spoken, but on pitch. Again, a generalization, okay? We could spend an entire like course just on that. But that's kind of the idea, and it's still around today in an ideal. Vitalian the First, we went over this in weeks 1, 2, and 3, where he is credited with the introduction of the organ into worship services, although that is not a primary source document. His presence was very, it was more of an architectural element than it was an actual performance. Look at the years now. We go from Vitalian the First to Pius the 10th. That's not a typo. By the way, I did have a typo last week. For those of you who caught it, thank you for the slew of texts that I got later on. I said it was like 2 Corinthians 4, and it was 1 Corinthians 4. So if you remember that from last week, that was the correction there. Corrected in the slides, so when those become available, you don't have to worry about that. Okay. Pius X, 1903. 1,300 years later, the first papal decree that permitted the organ in worship. Hard to believe that from the medieval time period through the Renaissance, through the Baroque, through the classical era, like we're talking Bach, right? 1600s to 1725. Not approved in worship, okay? Not there from a pope, from a papal office. Yes?
So what did they use all of Bach's organ music for?
Aha, glad you asked. No one else in the room will be. So the question is, what did they use Bach's music for? For entertainment. He was the rock star of the day, right? And so you would play. We have this idea of Bach as playing for these elaborate services and whatnot, but it's not necessarily true. The organ was allowed to be played while people were coming in, or while they were leaving, or during certain moments of Mass, but not like during like the homily, or not during the offices. Certainly not during certain times of year. We'll get to that actually right now with Paul IV, 1967.
So they bought the idea of music during worship? Gotcha.
Yeah, music during worship. You got to be really careful with this one, because it's not just music. It's not just like instruments during worship and how we define a worship setting, right? Sometimes we hear Mass and that whole thing becomes the worship setting. That's not how the Roman Catholic Church would define it. Okay, so you've got to be really careful about that. When we're talking about like instruments for our music, for singing, in a Roman Catholic setting that's super traditional, you're really talking about the choir, not the congregation, and what's happening there. Okay, but no, that was not permitted from a papal office until 1903. 1967, Pope Paul IV. This is the first detailed decree explaining how to use the organ. In 1903, the decree was, we're going to leave it up to your local authority to decide. 1967 is, we're going to take a little bit of that responsibility back, and we're going to show you what this is. Okay, bullet points. 1967, Musicam Sacrum. The pipe organ is to be honored as the traditional instrument of the Latin Church. Other instruments may be admitted only with the approval of the competent territorial authority. Instruments deemed to be suitable for secular music only. Instruments deemed to be suitable for secular music only are prohibited in liturgical celebration and popular devotion. So what does that just mean? Instruments deemed to be suitable for secular music only. Entertainment music, guitars, drums, right? Not appropriate for the church, Catholic Church, okay? Instrumental sound must not overwhelm voices. Texts must remain intelligible. Instruments must be silent during parts proclaimed aloud by the priest or its ministers. The organ, or other approved instruments, there's no description about what that is, may accompany singing or be played solo at certain moments, such as the entrance, the offertory, communion, and the end. There's no et cetera in that statement. Solo instrument playing is not permitted during Advent. When's Advent? About roughly Thanksgiving to Christmas. What do we hear in churches today around Christmas time? Okay. Also, not permitted during Lent. When is Lent? Around Easter. That's roughly February to Easter. The Sacred Triduum. When is that? Those are the 3 days before Easter. Okay? The Thursday, Friday, Saturday before Easter. Or in Mass for the dead, or during offices. And in a Mass, does anyone know what the offices are? There are 3 of them. A Catholic Mass will have 3 offices. I can't pronounce them, but they are the offices of Christ, the person of Christ, the Spirit of Christ. Okay? These are the functions that Christ performed. And these are what we would call today sacred moments. Things like what we would give our devotion to during communion, or listen and place value on the sermon, because that is a message that we can use for the betterment of ourselves and for others and for the kingdom of Christ. John Paul II, repertoire incompatible with the Spirit and norms of the liturgy should not be included. From a papal office. And now remember that. So like what norms would be in place for a pope during worship, right? Pretty conservative. Okay. Now, when they were discussed, the justification for organs is that it was considered uniquely fitting to support the chant and to lift minds to God. Magisterium, that is the teaching authority of the Catholic Church, like kind of like a council, if you will, and they regulate what is fitting in worship. That left it open for cultural interpretation around the world. Does this shock anybody? I thought that was fantastic. That was incredible to me. There's nothing else from the office of the Pope. That's really important to mention. There were organs in churches all over the place from the medieval time period on, really about 1200 onward. Okay, but it wasn't approved by the Pope until 800 years later. All right, Martin Luther. I'm not going to read everything on here, but I do need to point this quote out. Organ in worship is an ensign of Baal. I give the citations, plural, up here because these are the only 3 citations where this is found. I couldn't find it anywhere else. I couldn't find a primary source document that had that quote in it, but it's often cited, and it's really cited here, which allegedly cites a primary source document. Unfortunately, it is locked in the basement of some museum somewhere I don't have access to. So I don't know if he actually said that or not. What I do know, primary source, is that Martin Luther was the most pro-instrumental music founder of all denominations that existed. I also know that the congregations in which he was present was vocal only. So keep that in mind. All right. The Lutheran denomination was very accepting of organ and polyphony from the early times and moved onward. It wasn't very controversial. They were not short for justifications. Music being God's gift, instrument polyphony, many sounds occurring at one time, served the word and moved hearts to faith. So it was stirring. Luther himself never condemned instruments outright. He tolerated them. Those were my words. He tolerated them because he doesn't actually write against instruments. He just writes in favor of where they should be played, which is in schools. He was he was the modern day advocate for music education of his day. Chorales, anybody sing a chorale anytime soon? That was all him. Bach himself set several of his chorales to music. Mennonites. Moving ahead just a few years, the Anabaptists that split off into a few different directions. This is where it started. True evangelical faith cannot sing, cannot play to please men, but lives to please God alone. Notice the dates. We're here, 1500s, a cappella well into the 1800s, 300 years before we see an introduction of an instrument. 1870s to 1890s, somewhere in there, we have pianos appearing in Europe first, and then the American congregations. Was not accepted widely until just about 75, 80 years ago. Probably closer to 90 now I think about it. I forget that this is still 2025. Okay, they wanted a piano to help with four-part singing, to keep pace with the broader Protestant culture. Isn't that interesting? The culture wasn't rooted in instrumental music, though. It was rooted in four-part harmony. This sent me down a rabbit trail of this whole four-part harmony thing, on how drastic that affected the New Testament church the world over, singing in four parts. It was just as controversial in their day as instrumental music is in ours today. It's incredible, and that can't be understated. It's unreal. Churches split over singing in parts, which is an interesting piece of history, I think. Okay, Presbyterian. (1807) was the first documented Presbyterian organ installation, and it did cause a split to that congregation. That made news. That made national news in Scotland. That made that you could almost call it international news. There was an article printed here in the United States about that just a few years after that, 1809. In 1865 in Scotland, they formally permitted instrumental music in worship, but America's congregations decided to not follow that. I realize that 1865 and the late 19th century is the same century, but when I'm saying the late 19th century, we're talking like 1898 time frame, very, very late. Okay, we can't pinpoint a date on it, so I didn't put one on, so just be aware that it's around 1890s or so. They also wanted to support congregational singing. The way that they framed that was that organs help keep pitch, particularly in parts. Cultural respectability. This is the only denomination that cited this. Society felt that organs were kind of like high society. It was dignified in some way. Now think about the time frame, 1800s. What major denomination uses organs regularly at this time? Say the Catholic Church. Where is the Catholic Church primarily at? Rome is where it's housed, right? The Vatican, okay? And around here, where's the Presbyterian Church primarily at? Say Scotland? Good, close. Okay, it's around that area, yeah? Okay. What other major nation is near Scotland? England, the Church of England. Okay, this has a really interesting history and a tie. We're going to go back and forth here. Okay, we have Richard Hooker in the 1550s. The church retains music as an ornament to God's service and to help to our own devotion. How does that help this argument, or how does that inform our argument of instrumental music or vocal music?
It's not clear in that context what he means by music.
You're exactly right. So we've got to look at what he was involved with. The Convocation of 1562. How old was he?
22.
He was 8. This guy was 8 years old. So, and he's on here. All right, Convocation 1562 nearly passed a measure to abolish organs. It was defeated by one vote, probably Richard Hooker. No, but he was involved in that. So was his dad. I want you to understand this. Okay, we're going to try to get rid of organs defeated by one vote. Can you just imagine the tension? Right? Like that's crazy to think about. We have legislation that fails by one vote sometimes. And we think of that as, just barely. And there's a lot of tension on both sides because of that. Okay? So he grew up in this context. The quote is from much later in his life, but you can kind of see there is no, we can't tell, right, if he's talking about positive for instruments or not. He kind of takes this middle of the road approach. And he grew up in a very tense kind of place to be. William Ames, however, did not. The pomp of organs and the noise of trumpets, the tinkling of cymbals and such like, do not more belong to the church than the shadows to the body, for their childish rudiments, which agree not with the manhood of the church. English Civil War, the Puritans, that was a dark part in history. And it was, instrumental music was very much part of that religious war. It really was. Puritans did not like organs, and they actually went throughout the country to destroy them intentionally. Went from church to church, Catholic churches and whatnot, destroying organs left and right, burning churches in some cases, as some would say. I kind of think that might be a little bit hyperbole, but it's possible, I suppose. 20 years later, this was after Richard Hooker has died, the Anglican worship organs were reinstated. But it was controversial until when? Let's go back one. And when did the Presbyterian Church introduce? 1800s. And why? Because Victorian society said that it is full of dignity and refinement, and we have England next door who's doing the same thing. Okay. I put down here William Conybeare and John Howson. These two were commentators, if you will, scholars of the Church of England. They have a famous quote that I have suddenly forgotten, of course. I may have to get my notes out for this one. Oh, you know what? I'm just going to, it's in my speaker's notes. Oh, no, we can't go ahead. Okay, here we go. It's down here. You can read it. Commentary of Ephesians 5:19, I think. Yes. Make melody with the music of your hearts to the Lord. Let your songs be not the drinking of heathen feasts, but psalms and hymns, and their accompaniment not the music of the lyre, but the melody of the heart. So, given that, mid-1800s or so, it's still controversial. It is still controversial by then. Their justification, the Church of England, it helps for devotion. Again, it gets you that emotional rise. I don't think there's any question about that. It does. But an emotional rise for whom, I question. I'll leave it there because we'll save the rest of that for next week. Okay, Quakers. We've got to talk about Quakers. We have George Fox in the middle of the 1600s. Sing and make melody in your hearts to the Lord, and do not delight in outward music, which lifts up the flesh. There's your answer for to whom. Okay, when did the Quakers accept it? Oh, they didn't for 200 years. First piano was somewhere after 1900. Not too long ago. And then they quickly became common. Again, I know mid-20th and after 1900 is only about a 50-year difference. There's no date. We don't really know when a common justification came in. What we do know is that we have a piano that randomly appears in the early 1900s, like 1900, 1910. And then by 1950, they're pretty well established. And why? They specifically framed it as an aid. If you remember from last week, we have an aid or addition, right? That conversation, they specifically framed it as an aid for reflective or meditative worship. 4 meetings that were not strictly silent. That might tell you a little bit about how they worshiped before. They willfully acknowledge that instruments are not commanded. In other words, it was not authorized, but permitted for atmosphere. Makes sense. Fine, sure. They too, like the Catholic Church, allowed the piano to play while people were coming in, then while they were leaving, maybe as a special moment because little Johnny had worked up a solo of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Okay? And then it has gradually moved into other places. No shocker here with the Amish, I believe, right? That we could anticipate that they never adopted musical instruments. But I put this group up here because of why. Look at the justification that they had written, really. That they're viewed as a worldly ornamentation and are incompatible with humility, simplicity, and the separation from secular culture. Their justification was, back in early 1700s, we're supposed to be different. We're supposed to look different from the rest of the world. And how can we look different if we're doing the same things? John Wesley, I have no objection to instruments of music in our chapels, provided they're neither heard nor seen. Adam Clark knew him, traveled with him very, very closely, ministered with him, and he wrote, "Instruments of music in the house of God I abominate and abhor. It's the abuse of music. I here register my protest against all such corruptions in the worship of the author of Christianity." Again, within the context of worship, both of these men wrote freely about the joy and the benefit of studying music and learning it and playing it and enjoying it, but not in worship. Methodist chapels added organs in the 1900s, 19th century. Widespread acceptance happened fairly quickly after that. They were justified. The method, there was methodical, right? They were like, we were going to sing songs. This is an organ that can keep us on pitch, on time, and rhythm, and it helps everybody, especially when we want a big crowd. Everybody can hear it, right? It's not like you had a big microphone in the 1800s. Kind of, right? They thought it was a tool. Baptists, Charles Spurgeon, might as well pray by machinery as praise by it. Well, I mean, it is a machine, right? I mean, it is a mechanical kind of thing, yeah? Okay, Spurgeon Metropolitan Tabernacle was vocal only. Anyone know anything about this? Spurgeon preached weekly to crowds of thousands in England. Thousands, like out in the street. It was this huge, huge gathering, vocal only. The argument at the time, I've mentioned this, because the argument at the time was you cannot draw a crowd unless you appeal to the crowd. Spurgeon did it. Okay?
Yeah, and this is exactly the same time as the Victorian era.
It is.
So this is sort of opposed to the Church of England.
That's exactly right. Yes. I'm really glad you brought that up. I wasn't going to mention it, but yeah, it's kind of, I mean, it's a slap in the face to what else was going on at the same time. You're exactly right, Blue. For the benefit of online is happening. This is the Victorian era, and
That might be almost exactly the years of her reign, right? Edwardian started in the 1890s. President Roosevelt, the first one, met Queen Victoria.
that's true. I didn't think about that.
Queen Victoria.
Yeah, yeah, that is true. Yeah,
And she was queen before the Civil War started.
I didn't know that. Really? Wow, that's incredible. I'll have a comment about the Civil War in here in a second. 1859, Kentucky. That was a bad year for that state. Not just for this one. This is going to come up again. Baptists adopted organs and bands in 1859 specifically. This is kind of a split comment. This is not a justification, obviously. I'm introducing like why congregations are splitting here. 1859 Kentucky. You could, if you really wanted to, you could probably write a research paper and be right that instrumental music in New Testament worship in the United States was a legitimate cause of the Civil War. Not the cause, but a cause. So it was split. That was a split. Anti-instrument leaders, mostly in the North, saw them as mechanical. Anti-instrument was the South, distracting from true prayer. Adoption justified as expedient. It was a tool. Again, we can use this to help our people. Something we were a little more familiar with here, the Restoration Movement. Alexander Campbell, to all spiritually minded Christians, such aids would be as a cowbell in a concert. Anyone else have that Saturday Night Live skit? More cowbell. Okay, this gets very deep very quickly, so I have a few bullet points on the screen here. Okay, where are we at again? Where are we at? 1859 Kentucky. There were some heated things that came out of that year around the state. Gradual acceptance during the Civil War, I already mentioned that. Christian churches started identifying themselves as even instrumental or non-instrumental around the United States. Disciples of Christ congregations gradually increased at Churches of Christ, and the old paths, or the one-cuppers, we continue to reject instruments. And now I think, having read this statement, you can appreciate the generalization of it, right? And so think about all of the other denominations that we had already looked at and the generalization that we're getting at, okay? And the justification has continued to be, it's expedient, it's an aid, it's a tool for congregational singing. And the argument, this one here, the Restoration Movement, in general, introduces a new justification. We're not changing the substance. It's no longer just an aid. We're now rejecting the idea. We're moving from the table the argument that it's in addition, right? Before it was kind of an elephant in the room, and now we're addressing it and wiping it away. Church of God, founder warned against carnal display. That is within the context of instrumental music. The whole context is very, very long, so that is just truncated here. Urged that music should be plain and spiritual. It was a cappella for just a couple of years, if you look at it. Broadly accepted by 1910, 1920, somewhere in there. Greater congregational participation.
Do they have like half the guys just not singing?
I don't know. I really, it would be very weird. But that was their the greater congregational participation. They wanted more people to participate. Let's get some instruments in here. Evangelical outreach, same thing. We're having a tent revival. We're having a meeting. We want to bring people in. Let's rouse them up a little bit. Okay. So here we are at the end of it. This is kind of your summary points. We've been over this 100 times. Virtually every denominational leader. I can't say everyone that we have studied because of Martin Luther, because we don't have a primary source quote for him. So virtually every denominational leader was outspoken against instrumental music in the worship assembly. It's really important that it's that context within worship. Justifications to add instrumental music were potentially well-meaning. Who doesn't want to fill their pews and their chairs with churchgoers? Who doesn't want to have people feel at their very best while they're in the worship of the Almighty Creator, right? These are well-meaning things, but they're also self-indulgent. They're also what they want, not what God wants. And they were without that focus on the scriptural authority. Here's the summary of last week and this week. Week 6 is the conclusion of Unit 2. This is that secular perspective that we're going to be looking at. We're going to actually look at these justifications that were used over time, plus many more from the modern era, those probably that we have all heard or seen in the last 30 to 40 years.